Later today, as I'm recording this, me, Daniel from Bandits Keep, a couple other folks are going to get together and we were going to talk about, well, all sorts of stuff, but about dungeons and mega dungeons. And because we're all kind of disorganized and lazy, and this is kind of coming together very ad hoc, we've waffled a bit back and forth. But one of the main cruxes of things that we discussed on Discord earlier than my recording was the concept of mega dungeons versus dungeons. And someone brought up the point of, well, what is mega dungeon, or what differentiates a mega dungeon from a dungeon? Now, the most obvious answer, the one you hear a lot, is a mega dungeon is just a bigger dungeon, right? Mega plus dungeon, giant dungeon. And while I suppose that's technically true, I don't think that's actually a very helpful description, definition in terms of helping a GM understand, prepare, or run a mega dungeon. So let's talk about it. There are a couple ways I want to talk about mega dungeons versus dungeons, and they're both related. We have and this is all going to be meta kind of terminology, because I don't think anyway that when your party is investigating something that you call it out as this is a mega dungeon. It's just a place. I never call some place, unless it literally is a dungeon, this is the dungeon. It's the such and such of so and so. It's the tomb of Amenhotep, or whatever it is. So everything we're talking about is kind of behind the GM screen, prep stuff, philosophical stuff. So I want to get that part out of the way. If we look at what a dungeon is, we think about it as a location, generally broken up into levels, that is the subject of an adventure. Could be a one-session adventure, could be a multiple-session adventure, but that's really, to me, in my mind anyway, the scope of a dungeon. It's a singular location made up of different parts that fit together that is the subject of an adventure. When we talk about a mega dungeon, I think it is taking this concept of the dungeon, but really now we're talking about a campaign. A campaign, I would say, is a collection of interconnected adventures. A mega dungeon is a collection of interconnected dungeons, and they work fairly similar. If one dungeon is the subject of a single adventure, I would say one area, you could call it a level, aspect, a quadrant, however you want to divvy it up, of your mega dungeon is the subject of an adventure. And then when you put all these together, if you put it all together into one singular location of large enough scope, you hit that mega dungeon, and then we're talking about a whole campaign. The reason why I use these kinds of definitions as opposed to saying it's a bigger dungeon is because part of the whole problem or issue that folks have with mega dungeons is how to visualize how they work. If you just think about it, well, it's a dungeon with more rooms, therefore I can take this dungeon and instead of it being 20 rooms, I make it 100 rooms, suddenly I have a mega dungeon. Sure, technically, whatever, fine. But now try to run that. Try to run this singular dungeon over the course of a campaign. It's going to be tough sledding. Why? Because by that definition, it doesn't expose the challenges for what makes a popular mega dungeon. And that's when you get into all these other things. Now, I think Daniel from Bandits Keep pointed out on our Discord chat, talking about different levels. Each levels have different themes, all these things. And I think, yes, that's absolutely true. And that's definitely, if we want to look at, say, classically what a dungeon was, mega dungeon like Castle Greyhawk, that's exactly what it was. All these levels down, levels had different themes, and that's how you went. The reason why that worked, to the extent that it worked, if you like kind of funhouse dungeon types, was because you had to sustain interest through a whole campaign, whether it's all at once or whether you're coming back off and on as you're doing other things, as your party's doing other things. The point is that that mega dungeon has to keep being interesting. It has to hold up that interest. And how do you do that? Well, you can't just have it just be one massive space. Okay, you're going to be in an apartment complex and you do that for an adventure. Great. We've explored the different parts of an apartment complex. Now we're going to go through on multiple adventures. We're going back continually to that same apartment complex. Interest levels start to keep getting lower and lower. It's going to feel samey. It's going to feel boring. How do we fix that? We have different themes. One level's like apartment complex. Another level is like a giant arena. And another level is a catacombs and necropolis. Another level is filled with lava. Another level is infested with goblins. Classically, it didn't even really matter whether those made sense next to each other. We make our jobs a little more difficult as GMs when we try to figure out, well, How does it make sense? How do we get from a floor that's a giant bowling alley, literally a bowling alley for giants, and then the next level is filled with fire methods? Like, how do these two work? Totally different conversation. But the reason why we're thinking about these things is because for a mega dungeon, we are trying to figure out how can we extend the interest in this location, not only over one adventure, but over multiple adventures. Now, there are, of course, tons of similarities between mega dungeons and dungeons. After all, mega dungeon is a bunch of interconnected dungeons, if you will. And the same issues, the same problems, the same things we're trying to solve in a dungeon, making particular areas of the dungeon interesting and different and exciting to explore, are the same things we're working on a mega dungeon, except they're basically nested within each other, because we have to solve in a particular dungeon those issues, and then we have to solve them for the whole. So if we think about in a dungeon how the east side and the west side, we decided to have some kind of conflict there, how's that going to work? Well, in a mega dungeon, not only do we have to solve those issues, but we also have to solve, well, now we have two dungeons above, below, side to side, however you're going to have it work. How do they interrelate to each other? How does all those tensions work? It's a lot of work. There are a lot of ways to go wrong, and I think that's why excellent mega dungeons are rare. That it's rare to find really good mega dungeons. Now, folks will rattle off on the internet. You can go to Reddit, and I'm sure you can pull up a post that says, hey, tell me about the best mega dungeons. And sure, folks will rattle off a bunch, and that's fine. But of course, this is over, 20 years of, let's just say, OSR play, not including stuff from earlier editions of D&D or whatnot, and you come up with, I would say, probably maybe 5, really. It's a fairly small number, given the amount of years that have been going on. Actually, not that high a number. It is really tough. And the one thing with mega dungeons that dungeons don't have to deal with themselves is the time commitment. I found it important to create this video to define terms a little bit. Not only just as sort of a, hey, look, we're streaming later about dungeons and mega dungeons and things, so kind of look at this kind of as a primer, or at least my point of view. I think, Daniel's definition was a bit more technical than mine. Other folks who are participating may have different definitions than I do. And I think it's always important to let's just set our terms up so that when I say mega dungeon, you may not agree with my definition, but at least you'll know what I'm saying when I say it versus a dungeon. But I think it's one of those old school things that I feel like folks are still having a hard time wrapping their mind around to a degree. And part of it is just the mists of time. Part of it is just how our tastes have changed. Part of it is, like I was just talking about, it's tough. You think about the issues that you have to approach as a game master if you're going to say, you know what, I want to develop a mega dungeon. It's really difficult because it's already difficult to make a really good dungeon. And now you're saying, for example, I'm going to make 5 really good dungeons. Now, the dungeons may not all be the same size. Maybe you say, well, for this mega dungeon, I'm going to make them half the size. Instead of 20 rooms, I'm going to make them 10 rooms, whatever. That doesn't matter to me. But however you want to divvy up the work and the labor, it's tough because it's hard enough to make a good dungeon that's interesting and flavorful and has its own kind of unique feel once. And now you say, okay, now I'm going to do it 3 or 4, 5 times. And I think this throws people off. I think it also demonstrates why even with a well-done mega dungeon, it's not going to be for everybody. Not every party wants to keep exploring that same location. There's a reason why in things like video games, you'll go from the lava level to the ice level to this different levels. It's really hard. And now in a video game, you can have something where you're going from planet to planet, or you're literally traveling from a volcano in Hawaii to the Arctic Circle to somewhere else. But in a mega dungeon, unless you're really going to be Gonzo kind of funhouse type dungeon, you're going to find yourself constrained by these laws of, quote unquote, fictional reality that we've set up. So given all that, it's even more difficult. And I think when we look at why groups don't always embrace mega dungeons maybe as much as their GMs or referees would like to, that's a reason. I hope that in the streaming later today, we're going to get into doing some of the designy stuff. So look forward to that. But I just wanted to kind of talk about this briefly because I think it's something that comes up a lot. And it's something that, I'm not going to say it's misunderstood, but just that everybody has their different points of views on. So I thought I would give you mine. Let me know in the comments, everywhere, wherever, if you agree, disagree, what your take is, and tell me what your favorite Megadungeon is if you've read it, run it, whatever you'd like. Interested to know. And then look for the stream later today, and then I will link to it in the show description. If you're watching this later on, you can go check that out. Should be a good time. There's also a podcast that will be related to that also, and I will post a link to that whenever that goes up. Other than that, game on, everybody. I'll talk to you later.